Good evening, everybody. It's Contario, and I'm back again with Christ and comic books. And the goal of this evening's video is I'm looking to speak about Black Widow. We know that they have the movie coming out. We know that, of course, with coronavirus being out, that the movie has been postponed. However, I think it would still be good to speak on what we should be expecting from this movie, what we see coming with this movie, primarily as well as kind of touching on her origin a little bit, not going too deep into it, right? Because everyone's already knows that from having watched all the Marvel movies that we've seen thus far. So I'm not going to stick there. But I'm also wanting to correlate that with the biblical female heroes. Um, Normally, people always go for the ones that Jesus selected to evangelize that He is risen. All the women that He has impacted through ministry. But there's a lot of female heroes that take place in the Old Testament that are definitely worthy of being acknowledged. And I want to kind of acknowledge one from the book of Joshua. But let's first start this off by talking about Black Widow. Of course, we all know that she is a very famous spy for the Marvel Universe. She is one that works alongside S.H.I.E.L.D. to get, detective work done, take out target enemies and things of that nature. That is her primary purpose in this, as well as she's demonstrated her skill set in martial arts to be very, very high. That's why she's a key member of the Avengers. But if you really look back into the comic book aspect of it for her character, she was someone that was immediately brought in to be an assassin. That's what's interesting about how they're actually doing this movie from what we've been given of the trailer. So when we look at it from the comic book perspective, there's two origins that are primarily to be used to speak to on behalf of where she comes from. One of which being that her mother sold her into, being adopted into someone else's custody, and that being, I think it was Ivan Romanov, who took her in and trained her up in her martial arts, which is where she, of course, gets her skills from, being brought up by him. The alternate story there is also that her home was blown up as she was a baby. The mother gave her into the arms of Ivan Romanov for security, and of course, in him adopting her, that again being trained into being a spy and a detective. Of course, leading into her working with other countries to be able to be that person for them. But one of the most solid foundations to her upbringing is that of her being brought up in the Red Room, which is like it's like an adoptive home for young girls. And in there, they train young women to be spies, to use not only martial arts, detective abilities, and training them in that aspect, but also to take advantage of what they're capable of as a woman, because women have that power of seduction that draws a man in to listen to what they have to say. In one sense, they would say that stems from men thinking women are inferior, so they're vulnerable to women when they actually make a move. In other aspects, no matter if you're the toughest guy in the world, you're always going to be tempted by a woman. You're always going to be subject to a woman if you're not careful, especially if you're not careful. So that's where, they were also being trained up in that. Not to so much, go to bed with every man, but to make them give them enough to complete the mission. So Natasha Romanoff, which is Black Widow, was the most successful of all the women in her class. The thing about her, though, where they were trying to take a little bit from Wolverine's upbringing, which is what made him so popular, is the lack of knowing where his origin is. So that's the same thing that they bring in with Black Widow, is that she's mixed up as far as where her origin lies. If you look at the story of the MCU version of Age of Ultron, where they're speaking to that a little bit, she's having those flashbacks of being brought up with them. They call that the Red Room. That's where all of her training comes from, and in some sense a level of torture, because it is a bad memory for her, what she went through to become who she is now. Even more so from the comic book perspective, she was also observed as actually an enemy at first, because she came to oppose Tony Stark and the other Avengers in the origin of when she was first introduced. But as things fell into place, she ended up becoming a member of the Avengers. One of the things that made the relationship so difficult, however, was that she was fully trained to be an assassin. So the thought of killing criminals was something that was not a negative aspect for her. So that's something that really made her as an in and out character for the Avengers. As we see when we watch the MCU, she's primarily a part of S.H.I.E.L.D. more so than she is a part of the actual Avengers. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One thing that they did keep consistent, and as far as the MCU goes, during Civil War, is her siding with Tony Stark in the decisions that were made. So that's something that they took from the actual comic that they brought into the MCU. That's very important. But that's the story of Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, who also, for those of you that didn't know, she takes a particular serum that allows for her to maintain her physique and her young look. So she's actually I think she's around 70 or 80 years old, actually. So she's older than she looks. But that serum that she's been partaking of since she's been a part of the Red Room is what allows her to be so young. And that's the story of Black Widow. Now, when we look at what we're expecting from the Black Widow movie, they're trying to bring into a bit of an origin for her, not so much from what we see of the trailer, talking about the Red Room, but her actual family, who her father was, who her sisters were, and friends that she had during that time. And it looks like she's trying to bring down that organization from that past. But this is bringing about a level of family for someone who actually is used to being alone, used to not having that past, that connection. And the only connection she otherwise had from what we saw of the MCU was that of the Avengers. And we're getting a little bit more as we watch this movie, that there's more to her than just being a killer and trying to escape that past. So one of the things I want to connect into this when we're talking about biblical female heroes, I was a little bit, conflicted as to who to speak on. I wanted to speak on a woman known as Jael. And one of the stories about her is she was someone that contributed to warfare between the Israelites and the Canaanites, who had killed a leader because she would, to summarize it, someone wasn't willing to be obedient as a female judge known as Deborah was giving him instruction. He was being cowardice and not willing to be 100% obedient. So when she was able to give him what he wanted, and it wasn't sex, when she was willing to give him what he wanted so that he could fulfill what he was being told to do, she told him, well, you're not going to get all the glory out of this. This other woman will. So the other woman did, and she pulled off a kill on someone that thought he could be laxed in the territory that he was because he was a Canaanite and he had some level of dominance. But she ended up killing him off. That's a bit of on the assassin side of things. But I actually want to look at somebody else, and I want to look at Rahab. She's a very, very popular biblical female figure in the Old Testament. But one of the things that I want to acknowledge about her as we go through this story is how significant she is in one sense, and two, her ability to turn away, where she comes from to come into something new, and that lead into the things that it leads into, right? Because that's the same thing with Black Widow, is turning away from her past, where she comes from, what she's been brought into, to turn to the actual right side and to do the right thing to make sure that they're successful and being welcomed into that family, no matter who she is and where she comes from. So the thing about Rahab is she comes from Jericho, and this is a time when the children of Israel were going to war with the people in Jericho. They wanted to take the territory, basically. And so they sent in spies to observe the land, and in sending in these spies to observe the land, they went to hide out in Rahab's home. And hiding out in Rahab's home, one thing to identify, she wasn't actually a prostitute. But these children of Israel went to hide in her home. So with them hiding in her home, this was a great opportunity for her to, build her status by turning in the spies of her homeland, and to be like, yay, she did such a good thing, even though she's such a low state. She could have done something to really boost her position in her kingdom. But she didn't think about that. What she actually was aware of, which is one of the things we acknowledge when we read this story, is that she was someone that saw who was going to really turn out the victor, whether she turned them in or not. She believed at some level, she believed in God to where she was willing to do what was right in this instance of helping them to, not be found out by the soldiers that was looking for them. So she hid them away. And in hiding them away, she did it successfully. She got the guards to leave them alone. She lets those guys go free, of course, after they did their spy work. And she asked of them to please welcome me into, your people. Bring me in. Don't kill me off, of course, like you're going to do the others, so that I can be saved, so I can be secure. Right? And again, this isn't her, just doing some trick to be saved in the midst of warfare. It's not that simple. This is her making a wise decision based off faith. That's what's so important about Rahab. She wasn't making this decision because there was so much evidence that they were going to win. There was no evidence there like that for their victory. But like what took place back then was the storytelling. Telling about, what others have done. So she possibly has heard the stories of what God did with for the children of Israel in Egypt. She probably heard of some of their battles that they've had and they've come out victorious. The miracles that God performed to make sure that they were fed and make sure that they were provided for. So if all of those things have taken place and she's hearing these stories, there's no way that her people are going to have a victory over that. So I need to be on the victorious, winning right side, right? So that's where she made that decision to go with them. So something else to really bring into that is they of course get the victory. They of course take down all of the enemies that are in the territory, but they bring in Rahab. That's such a significant thing to see, that they brought in someone that was a prostitute, living a way that, in all honesty, God wasn't in favor of. But what's most important is when you're being brought into a new family, into a new place, they are going to give you those expectations, those rules, and those ways of being. They welcomed her with open arms for what she did, but in the same token, she welcomed with open arms their way of being, because she understood that that was a better way of being in some sense. She recognized, one, the power of God, two, the love of God. There's something that she recognized that not everyone was recognizing. That's why it wasn't everyone in the nation of Jericho that was being saved. It was just her, and possibly her family that was even being brought in here as well. So that's something that I think is very powerful, because the same thing happened for Natasha. She was brought up an assassin. She killed several people. She possibly killed several important people. But the shield brought her in, of course, possibly to use her, but she saw some good in being a part of them. She worked with the Avengers because, as her backstory illustrated, she saw there was some evil taking place that she needed to make right in those instances. Granted, there's a perspective of herself in trying to do good where killing is still a prospect. But even then, she's still growing, she's still maturing. Even now, in the book that they're writing for Black Widow and the all-new, all-different Marvel, she's having to confront some of her past in that sense. Her past is being used against her, and now she's having to make decisions to either coincide with those that are abusing that past, or make decisions to have that past dealt with and even having victory over it. So that's us talking about Black Widow. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the correlation between a biblical hero as well as a female hero in the Marvel Universe. I'm hoping to do Wonder Woman here next. Thank you guys, and y'all have a blessed day.